that one of the key items seemed to be asking the city to support expansion of the landfill site. That's rather like a tenant coming to you and telling you as owner, we want you to add 3 extra bedrooms onto this house that I'm currently renting. That's a bit above and beyond what people normally expect between a tenant and a landlord.
Okay. So, just to go, while you're still there, do you have a copy of this report at all, or have you seen it?
Yes, we do, and we've seen it, we read it, and it was informative. It was very informative for us when we conducted the audit.
I think it would be useful for the community to actually see it, to get a sort of a better understanding of the whole history behind this. I know it's history, and we have to look at what we have today and try to fix up, but knowing that may help to inform us on things as well. So I don't know if you could send a copy, or Mr. Bill, if you could send an electronic copy, would be the best.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for bringing that forward, because I think it's important to know, we have to know where this started, but we also have to then know how, and we can see all the problems along the years, but how we're going to deal with it now. I think that's what the Chair and the Auditor General, I don't know what particularly. Thank you.
I think there's an old expression about things ill began, ne'er end well, and this is something that started in a kind of a crisis situation in the town of Osgood, and the contract was set up and run and took a couple of years. I searched the City of Ottawa website for background material on Osgood, and it was away in the archives. Couldn't find it anywhere on the website, so I had to go to the archives. And I guess one of the things that I found most interesting is that there was a lot of handwritten stuff in pencil on the original council minutes about how the payments were going to be calculated. And it seemed to have taken about 2 or 3 years before anybody actually even specified a sample calculation of how the city's revenues were going to be calculated. So it certainly was a bit of a haphazard job that was put together, and the city inherited that problem and just tried to do their best with it. And now the fruits have come home.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wilkinson. Thank you, Mr. Toms. Sorry, if you could just stay one more minute, Councillor Aglai has a question for you as well.
Well, it's a comment and a question. So first of all, Bill, I certainly don't consider you to be a grumpy old economist. You be quite an engaged Ward 9 resident on this issue, and I know that you've had interactions with the city manager's office, city solicitor, city auditor. I've just found out about the archive. So in part, you're one of the people that have sort of kept everybody's feet to the fire on this issue. So I want to thank you for that. Your engagement on this, and you're not allowed to ask questions, but you raised a question. I'm looking at legal as I make this comment, and maybe legal at some point could comment on this, but Mr. Toms raised the issue of going forward what can and cannot be released under the Act in relation to the further information to get. I don't know, Mr. Chair, if it's appropriate time to comment on that now while Mr. Toms is still in the room and can get that answer, or if you want to hold that.
Mr. Chair, certainly aware of the inquiries from Mr. Toms, and we've discussed this. I know the original arbitration award was marked confidential by the arbitrator in order to protect the commercial information of third parties that gave evidence. Immediately after the award, the city pursued having that confidentiality marking removed. The arbitrator declined. The city continues to this day to pursue having that order vacated. And we heard, frankly, as late as last week from the arbitrator that to date he's kind of recused himself from that process and will pursue that through whatever means, whether it be another arbitrator or potentially a court application.
Thank you for that clarification. I hope that helps answer your question.
Thank you, Councillor Aglai. Councillor Drews.
Thank you. I want to comment. Thank you very much, Mr. Toms, and I know that You gave me lots of background on this inherited issue a file that I received, and I know you emailed my office multiple times, and I hope today you got your answers, and thank you for you being patient with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Thompson. Thank you, Councillor Drews. So we'll go to questions now for staff or for the Auditor General. Councillor Elson-Turi, and then followed by Councillor Drews and Councillor Wilkinson.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the Auditor General. First of all, thank you for bringing this file forward. We've only been asking for since 2007. That's the record, because that's the time when the landfill in Carp started getting some media attention. So we went to visit this site and we asked staff at the time some question, and it took us only 11 years to get them, and it's no fault of you or anyone. Unfortunately, this is one of, we just heard from legal, the confidentiality of the arbitration in this file, but we are here today. And I'm not sure how to describe, even in the previous township of Osgood will do a contract really for the benefit of the company against the taxpayer. For the life of me, I cannot digest this. It's almost like the one thing was missing, giving candy with that contract. And maybe the township should have offered candy and lemonade after they signed stupid contract like this. But nevertheless, it's been signed, it's been done. What I have a problem with, a few years ago, we came here on corporate on the FEDCO committee, and we talked to staff, and we asked staff, if a company is not compliant with the city and they leave jobs unfinished behind, what is the consequences of that? And I do believe at the time was Councillor Blois who put this motion on the floor, and I would like legal to make a comment about this. What is the policy on company did not fulfill their commitment when they have contract with the city?
Mr. Chair, the procurement bylaw contains two provisions. You saw them referenced in the Auditor General's report. One of them allows the city, based on the prior performance of the contractor, to essentially ban them from doing business for a period of time. And that would involve an assessment by the Chief Procurement Officer in consultation with the City Clerk and Solicitor of their overall performance. There is also provision, and this may be what the Council is referring to an additional clause which allows the city to reject an individual bid of a proponent on a go-forward basis based on it's what's called the litigation exclusion. Certainly the past history with the contractor demonstrates that the actual cost of doing business with them may be inflated by the virtue of the fact that the city is going to have to be involved in litigation with them. So you have one piece that deals with past performance, and you have another that deals with involvement in litigation. One addresses essentially all bids, the other, the litigation exclusion applies to an individual on a prospective basis.
At the risk not to go through numbers, because we're going to wait till we go in camera, my question to you, Mr. White, through the chair, have the Chief Procurement Officer ever pulled that card against that company, since that has not complied with the city according to our audit here in the last 8 years? So in the last 8 years, has that company still doing business as usual with the city? Yes or no would be great.
And Mr. Chair, I will not be able to give a yes or no, but the Chief Procurement Officer is coming down to that very issue right now.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, the Tomlinson Group of Companies have a number of contracts with the city and overall have a very strong performance record. On this contract, most recently they have begun cooperating, and our expectation is they will continue to cooperate. Any additional action that's required under these provisions of the bylaw will be based on the assessment of their ongoing success.
Were you informed by the city staff in the last 8 years Tomlinson has not paid the city a dime and has not cooperated? Have you been informed about this?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Most recently, I have been engaged on this file to address their ongoing performance.
And why took you 8 years to get engaged on this?
Excuse me, sir?
Why it took 8 years to get engaged about this? Because in the last 8 years, we haven't received any cooperation, according to the report, from Thomason. What it took the 8 years to comply, or at least force them to comply? Or if you want to wait till we go on camera, because there's a lot of question here, I think the public need to know this.
Mr. Chair, I think if I can categorize it, we were in arbitration up till about 2016. So we were fighting on that front and trying to get royalty payments, etc., and financial details through the arbitration process. As you heard from the Auditor General, his findings were the contract was well managed since 2014 under the current contract manager and director. And really, despite repeated requests for this type of information, I think we exhausted all avenues, and going to the Chief Procurement Officer and the City Treasurer based on the broader procurement that Tomlinson does with the city was really the last resort, and we did enact that this year, and it has gotten some results from Tomlinson finally. So I think that's kind of the linear way things happen. We were really in arbitration, and hopeful that that arbitration, and certainly you'll hear from our city solicitor about the arbitration process, hopeful that that arbitration would reach a positive conclusion for the city, and it did somewhat.
I'm still, Mr. Chair, and I don't know if legal can help me to understand this. So if in 2016 the final arbitration came out, so that's 2 years ago, and we know Tomlinson group of company do a lot of business with the city. I don't know percentage-wise, but I mean they're one of the large company in our city and do business with us. And according to our own bylaws, if company doesn't comply with the city, we have that tool to ban them from betting on contract. Why was not been activated? That section was just read by Mr. White.
So if I could interject to the city solicitor, perhaps to get a clear answer for the council, maybe this has to go in camera. I'd like to get your view.
This is not in camera information.
No, Mr. Chair, this is still in the periphery and still good for public conversation. Okay.
Well, Mr. Chair, may I interject in this just to, the question is, why was there any inaction? As I'm interpreting the question from the councillor in terms of when we know that this was going on. Going to section 37 and 47 of the bylaw.
Sorry, Steve, no, that's not what my question is. I accept the fact it was arbitration rules until 2016. You cannot do anything before the arbitration. Okay, no, but from 2016 till now.
That's what I want to talk about.
Please.
That's the part I want to answer.
Okay.
There was ongoing discussion with Tomlinson's. We weren't getting the cooperation, and quite frankly, we should have probably pulled that trigger sooner than later. There was a 2-year period where I think staff, generally, we try to work with companies. Tomlinson, as you said, is a large company in this community. They do a significant amount of business with the city. As our Chief Procurement Officer states, their work is generally fine. We have one sore spot here with Tomlinson, which is this particular file, and we keep working to try and get resolution. If I was to look at it again from after we settled the arbitration, what happened, we would have went sooner to try and get triggered. I think I would have got involved sooner myself. I was hopeful that we would try to reach some resolution, and we didn't until, quite frankly, the Auditor General got involved in the file, and we saw another path in terms of getting more aggressive with getting the information that we needed. The answer is yes, we should have, we didn't.
Okay. Mr. Chair, there's a lot of ifs and buts here, but clearly the taxpayer got a bad deal on this from day one. From 96 to 2018, 22 years, the taxpayer's been on the hook for something really shameful, to say the least, on a contract of this nature. And I understand there's a limit because the city has inherited this file from the former township, but nevertheless, it seems like even we had a tool in the toolbox, and I accept the fact that the explanation from the city manager, but I was hoping to come strong with this, because this is the only tool we have right now in our hand, is companies don't comply in good standard with the city, and even that was not used until now. But I hope this is a lesson learned for all of us, and maybe the question is going to be, comply with all the cleanup bills we have right now, Iraq and Austin, contaminated of a wetland. Is the city going to take a strong position and ban this company from doing business with us until such a time they cooperate with the city?
Mr. Chair, the company is, Thomason Group of Companies is fully aware of this. They received a letter from our Chief Procurement Officer, I don't know, several months ago, Will. I'm trying to remember when you sent the letter. It was in May. The letter clearly stated that this may be invoked should they not start to comply, because we were looking for financial information. They sent us financial information within, I think, 48 hours of receiving that letter. This is still on the table. Recommendation of the Auditor General, and we've agreed with the recommendation. We are in discussions with Thomason Group of Companies. I personally met with Mr. Wiley, with the president of Thomason Group of Companies. They fully understand the severity of this situation. They are also, saying, look, this is a file that has not gone well, and that we have a lot of good things going with the city, and I acknowledge that, but they also understand that we have to deal with this and get ourselves back on track in terms of protecting our taxpayers from the environmental issues that have been created there and the potential costs that could flow back to the city. They need to take responsibility for that. They've acknowledged that and have agreed to that verbally, and we're going to continue discussions after, as the chair said. This here is in the backdrop and in the background of what we can trigger if they don't cooperate, and I make that very clear with them that if that's the case, we're moving here. We'll have a big fight with them, I think, legally, but not afraid of a fight with anybody, quite frankly. And for us to invoke this would be the measure we take if we don't get cooperation from Thomason Group of Companies on this file right now.
Would management report back to us on a result, or that's going to be through the audit, like the final, like through the audit?
There's an audit recommendation that Mr. Hughes has put forward that we report back to council through the various committee structures on our progress on this file, and we will. I mean, I think based on the today, we have a responsibility to report back in terms of the outcome of the discussion, because we can't leave this sitting out there in terms of what's happening with the environmental issue, what's happening with all the recommendations. We plan to come back, and I'm sure Mr. Hughes will be doing a follow-up audit at some point also.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor El-Shantari, for your questions. Councillor DeRoos, and that'll be Councillor Wilkinson and Councillor Cloutier after that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the Audit Committee and their hard work, and I know I inherited this file, and most of you know that the Spring Hill is located in my ward, and I'm very, very interested in it. But to me, and I appreciate my council colleagues and the city manager's comment, and I believe that Thomason has been a company that has been doing business with the city and the township many years. So there is a big history and long time history. And I understand why the city manager and why the city didn't act as of Councillor Shantari was asking. And I realized that there is one contract went wrong. And I cannot blame Thomason or the Osgood Township. I'm sitting here on the sideline because I want to protect my community and I want to make sure that environmentally responsible for my resident. And what happened 21 years ago, I cannot tell you, is not part of it. But this is my comment right now on this file. It triggered a lot of interest in my community, and I want to make sure I am really working hard to dealing with the issue that they've been resurfacing. And I know that I am very confident and I'm assured by the city staff and by many sources that Thomason will be working with us and making sure that to address these issues one after the other. My concern is, on the meantime, what's going on currently and how we are monitoring the surface water and making sure that the residents that they live around the site are not impacted. And that question probably I can direct it to Mr. Wiley.
Chair, Ms. Journeau is coming up. She may be able to flesh out some of the details, but there is active monitoring going on at the site. It has been going on for years by Thomason's consultant. We're receiving that information. Since then, you will have received my memo of this morning. There's been no fill activity now for about a month. Tomlinson has started doing their interim cover on the closed cells of the facility, which will start to abate the groundwater. And there's active monitoring in, I believe, 2 drinking wells. One that's not, one's a property that's been assumed by Tomlinson, and there's no resident there. And I believe there is a resident, but we're actively monitoring in 2 drinking wells. And there's been evidence of any contamination at that point, and we will continue to actively monitor to protect the health of our residents.
Thank you. Madam, can you please give an idea how far you go doing test well for the community around the site?
So currently there is an active monitoring program around the landfill site, as Mr. Wiley said. And so most of the monitors are adjacent to the landfill site, and with the exception of those 2 drinking water wells off the landfill footprint itself. There is no indication that there is any evidence of contamination heading towards any of the residential wells along Bank Street or on any of the adjacent concessions. And so the Ministry of the Environment reviews that data from Tomlinson's consultant, and they also agree that there is little likelihood of any contamination being in any residential wells in the area.
On the precaution side, can we expand our monitoring well for the community, like for a bigger or larger geographically area that we do right now?
We would be happy to work with your office and discuss an expanded monitoring program, perhaps going and offering to residents within maybe 700 meters of the landfill site if they would like us to take a sample of their well water. So we'll work with your office directly and come up with a plan. That's all right.
Mr. Chair, will I be able to have a recommendation to staff to make sure that they keep monitoring and expand the area where we do monitoring around the site to probably 1 kilometer around the site? Is that something we can work with the staff?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, we can look at that, and how about we work with you directly on an appropriate plan on a go-forward basis?
I'm okay with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Drews. Councillor Wilkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is an awful mess, but let's see what we can do with it. Is the lease on this property confidential, or can we get copies of it?
Yes, copies of either agreement would be available.
Yeah, as I was looking at this thing, we've dealt a lot in our area with the Carp landfill, which is privately operated but on their own land. This is privately operated on city land. I think that's the only difference, right? You have to get permits from the Ministry of Environment to operate a landfill. Is that agreement with them or with us? Who has the agreement as an operator?
The agreement to operate is with the ministry and the municipality. Staff can correct me if I'm wrong, but the lease is with Tomlinson. And the agreement for the C&D demolition facility is with Tomlinson.
So Tomlinson has the lease for the aspect of the landfill, and this, the permit from the, and we have the permit for the est?
Mr. Chair, so there are 2 environmental compliance certificates for that landfill, or in that property. One is for the landfill site, which we own the ECA for that landfill. The second ECA is for the C&D facility, and Tomlinson owns that ECA.
And are the problems identified by the ministry for both together, or for ours and not theirs, or theirs and not? How does that go?
So currently the issues are with respect to the landfill's ECA, and the remedial action plan that's in place to address the issues, the environmental issues at the landfill, which is our ECA.
So that means that although they have a lease to operate the landfill, if they create a problem in doing so with drainage, we have to pay and they don't have to pay?
No, they are required for, they are responsible for day-to-day operations at that landfill site. So if they have caused environmental issues or degradation at that landfill, it is our opinion that they are responsible to remediate those issues.
Why are we doing the mitigation plan and not them at their cost? I mean, we seem to be paying a lot of money for the operation of this landfill because of problems created by the landfill, which is their responsibility, is it not?
So as the owner of the environmental compliance certificate, it was the city that submitted the remediation plan to the Ministry of the Environment. And so that plan has been approved in its concept, and we will be putting in a long-term, more detailed plan by the end of the summer to the MOE that will be for the actual design of the CAP and the stormwater management system for that site.
So are we going to charge Tomlinson for the cost of preparing their remedial work to be done on what they've caused as a problem from the...
It is our expectation that we will work together with them and that they will be responsible for those costs because the problems at the site were caused by their operations. It is our opinion that that is what has happened at that site.
But what about paying for the cost of preparing the plan? That's expensive too.
Yeah, well, at this point, we're just trying to get the plan done. It's got very tight timelines, so the city has already hired a consultant to help us develop the plan. And I guess we can work with Tomlinson on who's going to pay the consultant.
With them. I think perhaps going to the city manager on this and his discussions with them. These are costs directly related to their operation, and doing the plan is directly related to that. Should that not be part of your discussion with them, that they have an absolute responsibility for doing this?
Mr. Chair, maybe I can, just a couple of clarifications. One is, on the C&D lease, we've already given notice to Tomlinson, and that lease will not be renewed. So that comes up the end of this year, October. So that's really the source of what's gone into that land, the environmental impact. And the councillor is quite right on the design element. And going forward on the remedial action that will have to take place at the landfill, our expectation is that will be paid for by Tomlinson. And as the city manager had pointed out, we do have that agreement verbally in principle from Tomlinson, and we'll continue down that road.
And they would then, even though the lease is not renewed, they're still responsible for correcting the damage already done. But if we take it over, then the ongoing operation of that would be ours, but not up to that, not putting it in, certainly.
They are still under agreement with the city to manage that site, and it's still their obligation to ownership of that.
But if they don't do the work by the time the lease is up, which is pretty soon, stand then.
Sorry, Chair, there's two things. The lease on the C&D just takes the C&D plant out of the equation. They still have the management agreement on the landfill is still in action and still in effect. That landfill is filled up, is basically what the agreement says. So they are still on the hook for those costs while they're managing that site, and that's until that landfill, that's the only sunset clause in that agreement, is until that landfill is filled up.
Okay, that makes it a little clearer. And you're saying the problems are from the landfill and not from the other, which is the city is not renewing that lease. It will just close, or is the city going to operate, or what's going to happen there?
No, Chair, it will close, and they'll have to dismantle it and take it off the property.
Okay, and that's their land as well, isn't it, that piece?
There it's sitting on this landfill land, and in fact in stage 5, where the last stage will be filled in that landfill.
So they have to return it back to the city's land back in good condition of some sort?
We would expect to see it have all the proper environmental measures put in place, including an impermeable cap, stormwater abatement, etc.
Okay. I think those things are really important because there's big dollars involved with those, and other landfills are required to do them. They should not be getting a free ride on the city. There's other things that come up, but I guess they're still not paying to put Osgood waste there, but Osgood now, part of the city, pays the overall cost of all landfills, I expect. They're being paid the same way as any other household would in the city? How do we know?
Currently, the residential waste from the township of Osgood is sent to the Trail Road landfill along with all the other residential waste in the city.
Yeah, that makes sense. So many things here. The 30% discount in the rates that they've done for their own companies, which seems to be, I think I saw it was 76% of all the stuff going there. That is a huge loss of revenue and things like that. And I know that in the lease they have the right to set the rates. But does that mean that they can give a discount and not pay us, or they can give the discount but still have to pay us if they got the full rate? That's a little bit unclear in the report.
Mr. Chair, I think those are issues that we think can be addressed with the provision of better information, which hopefully will come from the new relationship, which appears to exist in relation to this contract on the part of Tomlinson. Staff have certainly asked a long list of information that they've asked for that would help determine whether or not that was appropriate, and to be quite frank, that hasn't been forthcoming. But that is work that would have to be done that would determine whether or not that discount was reasonable or appropriate, and then more importantly, it would allow staff to determine that, along with all the other information, whether or not the revenue was accurately stated, and if the expenses were appropriate, which would mean that the royalties were either understated, overstated, or accurate.
And the fines that they used for cover, if they had been sent to any other landfill, I take it they would have had to pay tipping fees for those fines?
I believe they would have to pay if they were sent to another landfill, but that's a question you could address to
That's
staff.
one of the questions you have in here as well that you've mentioned, that they're saying there's no revenue from that, which means the city doesn't get its proportion, which we could use to put aside for the future issues which we're obviously going to have on that site after they've finished and closed it all.
There's a long list of issues that have to be, and if the relationship with Tomlinson is improved, then it would allow staff to get answers to questions that they've been asking for a very long time.
But I do think we have to be cautious. It's sort of like they didn't provide information very easily or very much of it until they were kind of, I can call it kind of caught. Now they're going to make up for it because they know what the result could be extremely difficult for them. But I think we have to be really cautious, and not just with this company. I think this is a warning about being very cautious with any corporation that's working with us and have done for a long time. We can be a little complacent sometimes with doing things. And I know we found that last year. We looked at asphalt and all those kind of things. It's all part of the same basket, really. So I think that's the city staff thing. I think you have taken it up pretty seriously from what I've heard, and I thank you for that. But I think better to get, and we have to do what we've got now and moving forward, and we have to be very cognizant that the taxpayers' dollars, this is wasting, not either wasting or not treating correctly the value of what is for the municipality, and that's not what our job is. So thank you for bringing this forward. It's a very difficult report to read and to try to figure out, but it has to be out there, it has to be dealt with, and I'm glad it's not being, not given its due respect and importance in the past that we're going to do that now. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Wilkinson, Councillor Cloutier, and after you it'll be Councillor Blais, Councillor Aguilar, Councillor Kadri, and Councillor Manette.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of more clarifying questions with respect to the ongoing costs and the environmental damage. The page 43 of the report says the Ministry of the Environment and Climate Change determined that the landfill was out of compliance. Can someone tell me how they came to be involved? What prompted their involvement in December?
So they've been involved with the file since the environmental compliance certificate was issued. So as a requirement of the certificate of approval, you have to put in an annual monitoring report. That report is reviewed by ministry staff. They make comments and recommendations, and then the monitoring program is adjusted based on that. So the Ministry of the Environment has had a long-term engagement on this file, and it's really only in the recent years where the environmental conditions have begun to degrade.
And that's when they asked for a remediation plan?
Exactly.
Okay. Put forward a remediation plan, and that is a little bit more capital intensive and lower ongoing costs, and Tomlinson has objected to it. The province has accepted our remediation plan. Does the Ministry of the Environment have the final say on how the remediation plan, which remediation plan will be chosen?
Well, so they have already agreed with our concept, which is to put an impermeable cap on that landfill site and a stormwater management system to deal with the runoff from that cap. So they've agreed with that in principle. Now we have to develop a functional design, which they will also comment on and approve. So it's an iterative process. And that approval, once we put in the design at the end of the summer, could take up to a year, because they will have stormwater and groundwater reviewers and technical reviewers look at our design to ensure that it will meet the conditions of the site.
So again, that's our plan, and that's the one that's been approved by the ministry. Does Tomlinson have the opportunity to appeal that plan?
No, we are the owner of the environmental compliance certificate, and as such, we have submitted the plan.
So the issue will come down to costs. Who pays for the closing costs or the remediation plan? Who pays for the ongoing costs?
Yes, I mean, we have heard from the city manager that Tomlinson has agreed to cooperate and work with us on...
But we don't have a contract. We don't have... we are still governed by the lease agreement and the memorandum of understanding from 1996 and 1998.
Correct.
So, and they have been, in some ways, we've heard non-compliant with that to date in terms of being forthcoming with information and royalty payments, and more important to me, the ongoing long-term environmental impact of this site.
Yes.
Is that a fair assessment, or?
Yes.
Okay. The site has reached capacity, I see on page 38, but is that for the and that's for the landfill?
I'd like to interject. Sorry, it has not reached capacity, so there's still a quarter.
The agreement is effective until the landfill has reached capacity, and it's at 75%.
You are correct.
Yes. And for the construction demolition section, it is, we have issued a notice on May 4th to stop using that facility.
It was it wasn't on May 4th, but yes, previously in the spring we had sent notice that we would not be renewing the lease for this construction and demolition facility.
Chair, the May 4th date was to stop filling the landfill.
Okay, thank you. With respect to the insurance, the Auditor General mentioned that we're missing some insurance. Does that, while I recognize we don't have Schedule E, would that schedule presumably contain some liability protection for the long-term costs of environmental damage? Is that generally what we would find in an insurance document such as that is missing?
So it's my understanding that Schedule E was to outline what the insurance requirements were. Unfortunately, the city does not have a copy of Schedule E, so we can't determine what the insurance requirements were stipulated to be in the contract.
So generally, best practices, and maybe the procurement officer or the treasurer or legal might speak to this, would such a document contain protection for the city for long-term environmental liability that would be brought by the Ministry of the Environment, by an adjacent landowner, by any other stakeholder?
Mr. Chair, it's of course difficult to say what the parties agreed to in 1996. There are provisions in the agreement itself for indemnification of the city. That is separate and apart from the insurance requirements. What we do have in place, there is insurance in place. The difficulty, of course, is reconciling the insurance that is in place with what was agreed to, or what arrangements were in place back in 1996. So that is the difficulty, and I think the path forward in the event that we are unable ultimately to find any record of what Schedule E contained would be to look at the existing insurance and compare that from kind of the industry standard of today as to whether it's sufficient protection.
Okay. And my final question is just back with respect to the contract inception, and again, we inherited this. Does the construction and demolition, originally the 1996 agreement was just Osgood Waste, but the 1990